Recently, I did a video about the old D-frame build that I did with the glass tubes and the green fluid and the SLI Titan XPs. And I've been talking about the fact that this summer I'm going to do more water cooling types of discussions. We're going to sort of kick off water cooling month, if you will. It's not going to be just water cooling stuff this month. So if you're not into that, don't worry. We'll be talking about other things. But it's the right time to talk about it because it's hot. And I apologize for the title if it seemed a little bit clickbaity, but I need to get your attention because I think water cooling is relevant again. For a while there, it kind of went not relevant as much because efficiencies were good. Now efficiencies sort of suck and water cooling is a bit more relevant than it's been in years. So let's talk about some of the most common things that people get wrong when it comes about the ideology behind putting liquid in your computer, which sounds very counter safe or productive. The Height Y70 dual chamber ATX PC case provides users the familiar look and feel of the Y60, but with an increased component compatibility and thermal performance. With 4 unique colorways and a beautifully crafted 3-piece panoramic glass, the Y70 provides a clear window into the heart of your PC. Its expanded 4-slot vertical GPU support with an included 4.0 PCIe riser cable provides ample room for the largest graphics cards, while additional space between the edge of the card and the glass provides improved airflow. Up to 3 120mm fans can be mounted below the GPU to provide a direct path of cooling, while up to 360mm AIOs can be mounted to both the top and side. Y70 also provides up to 180mm of clearance for air coolers. To learn more about the Height Y70, visit the sponsored link in the description below. Okay, so we'll kind of go from maybe some of the more common misconceptions to some of the more, I don't want to say nitty gritty, but some of the misconceptions people may not necessarily realize that they're spreading that is misconception. So first and foremost, it's obvious, we've talked about this a million times, water cooling your computer and making your computer components run cooler will not make your space run cooler. It will not make your space cooler at all. In fact, recently I talked about a video about ways to get your computer running cooler, which also includes making the space your computer in cooler, because the ambient temperature of which your case and your system exists within is the #1 factor of what's going to affect the cooling of your PC outside of the cooling components themselves. So running a water-cooled PC could actually make your space warmer. And the reason I say that is because there's a more efficient transfer of heat from the component into the atmosphere around it, which is going to heat it up. Like anytime I do gaming on Skunkworks, which has a Optimus block cooled 4090 with a 14900K, again with an Optimus block running 2 giant radiators, a 480 and a 560. When I'm done live streaming, because I have terrible airflow in that room and I don't have like a mini split or something I need to install in there and try and get the ambient temps down, it's hot. It's hot as balls. I'm like peeling myself out of the chair when I'm done. And that's gross, I know. And I have 2 windows in that room, but I can't open them in the summertime because when I'm gaming at night, it's still like in the 90s Fahrenheit, which is like the upper 30s of Celsius. So I'm not gonna open the windows. That's warmer still than it is in that room. So let's just get that out of the way right now. Water cooling your system is not going to make your room cooler. I've seen comments, and that's why I bring this one up every time we talk about non-truths when it comes to water cooling, is I see people say, water cool your system, it'll run cooler, so then your space will be cooler. That's not true. The only way that would help in any way is if you reduce the actual heat dissipation or watts and TDP of your components itself to generate less heat. You gotta reduce it at the source. You don't reduce it at the exchange. The exchange is all about heat. So let's get that one out of the way right there. The next one I want to talk about, which is kind of an obvious one when it comes to people that are either against water cooling. There's many reasons people would be against water cooling. There's the cost. It's significantly more expensive to put water blocks on your CPU and your GPU if you decide to go GPU route as well. Tubing, reservoirs, fittings, pumps, distro plates, and you can kind of go from like basic to crazy custom looking systems that cost well over $1,000 plus to water cool your system. So cost is the one that people tend to really sort of lean into on why you shouldn't water cool. We'll talk about that one in a second. But the most common one is if you get a leak, your system is going to be ruined. That's actually not true. And the reason for that is many reasons actually. We are not dealing with tap water. At least if you're doing it correctly. If you're doing it correctly, you're not dealing with mineral-rich water, which has a lot of ions in it. Now, ions are what carry the electricity through the components that are now bridged with fluid, if you will. Water itself does not transfer electricity. It's the elements inside of contaminated or non-deionized water, or distilling water also kind of as a deionized process. But anyway, it's the minerals and things that you can't see in water that you find when it's running through tap systems or iron pipes or copper pipes. It picks up ions from those metals and Heck, well water has rock minerals and stuff in there. You can't see them, but they're there. If you were to take them to a lab and test them, you'd find many parts per million of other crap besides H2O. That is what actually carries the electrical signal or creates an electrical transfer or conductivity of the fluid itself. Pretty much every single fluid on the market these days has some sort of non-conductivity to it.
It's still going. It's dripping on the, oh, it's dripping on the power. Whatever. What the?
Now, like I said, it can pick up some conductivity over time. It's touching metal blocks. It's touching nickel if it's nickel plated, or copper if it's bare copper, or AIOs touch aluminum. There are actually a lot of aluminum radiators and stuff in there. We won't talk about that one yet. We'll get there in a second. But we actually did some tests where I just doused graphics cards or motherboards with water. And yeah, I was able to show that the system does turn off.
Achoo! Whoa!
But I also was able to just simply turn off the power, dry it off.
All I'm doing is dabbing it right now.
And then boot it right back up and had no problems whatsoever. In fact, you can even use isopropyl alcohol to help aid in drying up your system. All right, can we dry it off and survive? Green light, image, there you go. The most annoying part is gonna be the fact that you now have probably a glycol or an ethylene or some sort of gall in it, which is gonna get sticky and gross, and that's what you have to clean up. Fortunately, a detail brush and some isopropyl alcohol is all you need to get that off. Now, the isopropyl alcohol also evaporates extremely quickly because it's 98 or 99% alcohol. So with that, it means that you can spray the alcohol on it, it'll absorb the water, or the water will mix with it, and it will evaporate just as fast with the alcohol. So there's ways to clean the systems, and it's actually very, very difficult to completely bork or break a system with water cooling. Now, I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm saying it absolutely can happen, and it happens all the time. Because sometimes you get that very unlucky drip on a very sensitive component that somehow doesn't have a protection circuit or something built in. So you'll get a little bit of a problem there. And I've seen people send me videos of a drip that happened on their GPU on just the right spot, and then you see a little scorch mark where it bridged and popped something. Fortunately, most of those issues can be fixed from an authorized, not authorized, but a professional like electronics repair facility, something like Lewis Rossmann or whatever. Professionals like that can more often than not fix those components as long as it's not something that you can't replace in terms of getting the SMD or the component or the chip or whatever might be damaged. Although leaks sound very scary, they are not nearly as scary as they used to be when we were quite literally using tap water to cool our system. Now, tap water is obviously a terrible idea for a multitude of reasons, not just because of the fact that it's got all that crap in there that I just described that could cause conductivity and fry your system if you get a drip. It also can, if you just have straight tap water in there over time, you'll start to notice algae growth. The amount of bacteria that is also in tap water is kind of scary if you actually sit there and look at it. Now, bacteria is a living organism and it wants to grow, and so are things like algae, and they are going to grow anywhere they possibly can.
Life finds a way.
And with that way, science happens, and then you start getting floaty gunk in your loop. It starts to turn cloudy, and then you start noticing a colony growing inside of anywhere there's big restriction, like your radiator and your jet plates and stuff like that. Distilled water is available at every supermarket. Typically, all you need is distilled water and a few drops of a biocide. Now, biocide, you can find those pretty much at any sort of like aquarium supply store or fish tank store or whatever too, because it's the same kind of stuff they put in water to for various fish tanks. Now, obviously, I'm not talking. There's a million types of water you need for fish, right? You've got your salt waters and you've got your fresh water and all that stuff. But algae growth is the number one thing you don't want in an aquarium. So you can find biocides, which literally just take 1 or 2 drops. And all that does is inhibit the growth of algae and other types of organisms that could grow in water. Because we all know water is the building block of life. And you'd be surprised what can find its way living in your system if you don't use the right kind of fluids. So a second ago, I said that cost is usually the number one reason why people don't want to water cool. Let me back up. I've never taken an official poll, but those are the 2 things I see consistently: cost and fear of damage. Now, cost is a very valid reason someone wouldn't want to water cool, but I want to point something out. When I started water cooling systems back in like 2000, 24 years ago, holy shit, I just realized the date. It's almost a quarter century. Anyway, there weren't many brands on the market. I mean, we had like Swift Tech, and we had like Danger Den, and Coolance had kind of started making a name for itself and popping up there. EK Water Blocks was around. I think they started in like 2004, 2003, somewhere around there maybe. So we had a handful of brands, and because there was scarcity in the market, things started getting more expensive. Like $100 water block was considered expensive when I started. Like the first GPU I ever water cooled was actually my 8800 GTX Ultra from EVGA. Like that goes way back. 8800 GTX Ultra, that's like way back in the day. Anyway, I want to say that was like $105 water block back in like 2005 or whatever that time 2005, 2006 era. If you even account for inflation right now, that's a expensive water block. Today, not so much, because you can find $300, $400 water blocks. Like the Optimus water block that's on my system at home, it's like a $300 plus it doesn't cost $300. It costs $300 plus. I can't remember the exact cost, but it is a high-end boutique type of block. Fortunately, because now we have so many players in the market, you've got a good separation in tiers of pricing. You've got your boutique stuff, like I just mentioned. You've got your, EK water blocks, and then of course you've got your heat killers and your Aqua Computer, which is a German company, very high-end stuff. Then you've got your mid-range stuff, which is not going to break the bank, but it gives you a good mix of quality and then a good mix of price. And you're talking like now Corsair Hydro X stuff. Obviously, we've got like heat labs, radiators. We've got I can't think of all. Alpha Cool's been around for a long time. They make a good mix of affordable and more high-end boutique type stuff. But now we've got stuff most people have never heard of, which I think they're hearing about now. We've got Barotech, we've got Bike Ski. There's a plethora of names that I can't even pronounce on Amazon now selling stuff. And we took a risk and a chance on one of those recently. For Phil's system, I talked about it in his. When we did his move to the 011 Dynamic Mini, we needed some fittings. I didn't have any soft tube fittings. We wanted to go soft tubing. And I didn't have the right size fittings for the tubing we were gonna use. So I went on Amazon and I found this brand called Dressina. I never heard of them before. And I went, well, it's like 25 bucks for a 6-pack of compression fittings. Compression, back in the day, I was spending $5-6 a barb. No compression, just barb and zip ties or a hose clamp or something on there. It was very industrial looking. But now we have options like this where, what, $25 divided by 6? We're talking just over $4 a fitting with a compression. And the quality of them was actually really good. I'll try and remember to put a link down there, but if I don't, it is in Phil's video. So now we're getting brands like this that are giving you quality options where now you can build a custom water loop or an open water loop without having to break the bank. Back in the day, where around the time I started my channel, about the cheapest you could build a loop for was about $300. So let's do the comparison on that. I'm saying right now you can spend $300 on a single block. But I was able to do a full custom loop with radiator, fittings, tubing, CPU block, pump, and reservoir for about $300. Now I feel like we could get back down close to that if we were doing like just a CPU loop by utilizing some of these ODM brands. So these are brands like that are making products for other companies and they're already tooled and dyed and set up for creating these products. So they're creating them as well. Now, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not they're sort of like stealing IP or whatever. I don't know. They're selling on Amazon. I have to assume I don't know where the designs came from. That's up to you, right? I don't recognize some of the designs that Dressina is using, so I can't say they're just copies of something else. But they're options. And I want to do some videos about some of these very inexpensive options to talk about the quality of them so you guys can find ways to do it without having to go, well, I got to set aside $750 to do a basic loop. So that's not necessary anymore. And that I just want to throw that myth out there right now that this is probably one of the better times than ever to do water cooling because there's more options than ever. Unfortunately, all those options also lead to some of the most confusion than ever because there's so many freaking options out there. Like go to Performance PCs, performance-PCs. So go to performance-PCs.com. That's actually where I get all my water cooling stuff mostly. And just do some sorts. Like just go to tubing. Just click on tubing and then see how many options there are on the left side. Just go to fittings and see how many thousands of types of fittings there are from different brands and colors and stuff. So here's one I hear really often, and I think I'll just be having to beat this one into the ground over and over and over for the rest of my life. And I think people are taking automotive knowledge over to PC and they're not directly comparable because I see, oh, loop order matters. You don't want hot, like if you go out of your pump and you go into your GPU and then into your CPU, where you're just gonna make your CPU get hot because you're taking hot coolant from your GPU into your CPU. And then vice versa, if you go from your CPU to your GPU. So people have this idea that there needs to be radiators in between every component. So if you're gonna go from pump to GPU, then it should go to a radiator, then to the CPU, and then to something else. Or there's no point in water cooling like RAM and motherboards and stuff necessarily. You can for custom loops, but I don't personally think it's that necessary these days. If you have the right motherboard design and VRM coolers, you don't need to water cool them. It's just a nice to have, not a must have. But I digress. That's not true. We are not dealing with extreme deltas between the cooling temperature and the fluid itself, the fluid temp, and the heat source. You cannot compare the heat being generated in a combustion chamber and in the head of an engine versus something that is dealing with 100 C at the high end of type of temperature you're dealing with. They're not comparable. Not to mention there's no thermostat in there. There's nothing stopping or reducing the water flow so that it sits longer in a heat exchanger to pull more heat out. That's necessary in automotive because one, you don't want to overcool the engine because then you have inefficient burn of fuels. And two, you don't want it to just constantly be cycling because then it never sits in the radiator long enough to actually cool down. They're not comparable with PC. PC loops are going to equalize at whatever temperature the amount of heat exchangers you have are capable of dissipating the heat. For instance, every single radiator has, and they're not really listed, they don't really list them like they do on air coolers, but every radiator has a thermal capacity rating to it. So let's say you take a 360 radiator that's 30 mil thick and it has something like 450 watts or 500 watts of heat dissipation capabilities to it, and you put a 250 watt CPU on it, that CPU is never gonna thermally saturate that radiator. So what's gonna happen is as your loop is turning and constantly going through, let's say you have a constant load applied from your CPU, that radiator has determined what that max temperature is going to be. The same thing happens if we add more components. The amount of heat being put into the loop is now a mathematical equation of the heat sources themselves, which in this instance would be a CPU and a GPU. The radiators are still going to determine what the max temperature is. You might see, and we've tested this, we haven't tested it lately with some of the more hotter components, but if my loops technically, I have two loops in my system, but I tend to go GPU to CPU more often because the GPU is usually a higher heat source. But typically what we'll see if we load up the GPU, we might see 1, maybe 2 C of increased temperature on the CPU outlet. However, to load the GPU means you're often adding some sort of load to the CPU as well, and the temperature rise you're actually seeing is coming from that small load on the CPU rather than being a full load. If you're loading up your GPU to 100% and you're seeing 55 C on the GPU temp, your coolant's probably somewhere around 32 C. If you look at your CPU temp, you might notice it went from an idle before you loaded up the GPU of let's say 25 C, and now it's at like 30 C or 35 C. And if you look at the actual utilization on the components, you'll notice as the GPU goes up to 100%, the CPU has to do something. It can't just sit there stupid, not doing anything. So the temperature increase that you see actually comes from the small utilization that happens to the CPU, not from the hot coolant coming out of the GPU. Because believe it or not, if you measure the inlet and outlet temperature on a GPU, they're also within only 2, maybe 3 C difference on either end. It's not enough to raise the component temperature itself. There's too much design and too much thermal capacity happening there, both with the loop and the efficiency of the component itself. I feel like I need to do a deep dive video on this. I don't do deep dives very often, but I feel like I need to do a deep dive on this because it's the most common misconception is loop order. That loop order matters. The only thing that matters in your loop order, period, is that your pump is fed by a reservoir or something. It doesn't even have to be directly connected. It's just you need something feeding, a volume of fluid feeding the pump, and that's just for priming purposes. That just makes it easier to fill the system. You could have no reservoir at all. If you were to do a vacuum fill through a valve, you don't need anything feeding the pump. The pump could be at the very top for all it matters, believe it or not. It's not like an AIO where you have a cold plate and a pump and a CPU block all together. You could have the pump at the top and it would still be able to cycle the air, or well, we don't want air, but you'd be able to cycle the fluid, no problem. It's not ideal. You'd want your pump at the bottom, and that again is for filling and bleeding purposes. The reservoir just also gives you a place to feed the pump and also a place for air to collect so you can get all the air out of the system. Like I'm gonna have to set up temperature probes on an actual like inline fluid temperature probes, because the fluid temp is what we need to monitor to actually show that what I'm saying is true. is you need to measure the inlet and outlet on each component and measure the temperatures across the loop, before the rad, after the rad, before the GPU, after the GPU, which is also before the next component, and then after the next component. That's what we need to do. If you guys wanna see that video, mash the like button and say, hell yeah, do that temperature comparison video, because I think it might be enlightening for people to see that. Maybe the last one here, that's just I don't know if it's necessarily a myth, but it's that you need to have some sort of special training or knowledge or tools or whatever to be able to do a water-cooled loop. Realistically, if you're not doing something like rigid tubing bending or even glass bending, I dabbled in that in the last couple of years, was actually bending glass tubes. It was fun. I haven't done it in a long time, and I think with the new shop setup, I might try and do some more of that. Now that I've learned a little bit more about how to properly retemper the glass after I bend it, because apparently the way I was doing it was actually making it brittle. Fortunately, nothing is broken, as you saw in the D-frame. But it's that you need to be some sort of expert. But short of any of those special tools for rigid tubing, if you're doing soft tubing, all you need is a small screwdriver kit, something like an iFixit kit or something like that, or your fingers. Well, actually, and your fingers. You need fingers for that. But that's just for putting on stuff. You need your hands and a minor toolkit. Now, Phil's gonna be like, where the hell is this going right now? The reason for that is installing the block usually needs nothing more than a Phillips head screwdriver in many instances. Or if it needs an Allen key or something like that, most blocks will come with any tool you need to install it in a full instruction set. Soft tubing is the best place to start to get your feet wet, no pun intended, in water cooling, because you don't have to necessarily think about bending tubes and having them all line up. You literally just connect them like hoses. They're just hoses, like water hoses. So that's all you need to get started. And you can take a loop like that, have your components and do soft tubing. I still love black rubber tubing because it doesn't leach plasticizer. Any clear tubing, whether it be vinyl or PET or whatever that's soft and malleable, will absolutely over time turn cloudy. It's just the chemical reaction between the plasticizer that's inside that tubing to keep it flexible and the way it interacts with coolant and fluid. Even just straight water will do it. Okay, it has something to do with the heat and all that. I can't even get into the science behind that because I personally never cared to learn why, which is why I just stopped using it. I just use black rubber tubing now because the black rubber tubing doesn't leach anything. The black rubber tubing is far more resilient than any of the clear tubing. Not to mention, I just think black tube looks great these days. Even for rigid, I use black tubes these days. Just not seeing the coolant anymore is kind of like the new cool thing to do, and just seeing it in my reservoirs. But the cool thing is you can set your loop up, and if someday you go, I just really love the way rigid tubing looks, you can still use all the same parts. You don't have to change your fittings. Although there are brands out there that have dual fittings. It means it's simply the cap change and like an internal piece that comes off to convert from a barb to a rigid. I haven't looked at those, but I think it might be interesting to take a look at because then it gives you an option. You could start with soft tubing, and then you can convert to rigid. And they're by a name brand. It might be Monsoon. I can't remember. Anyway, Monsoon came out with some really cool stuff back in the day. But yeah, you don't need to have any sort of expert knowledge. If you're comfortable with taking the cooler off your GPU, that's the hardest part when it comes to putting a water block on a GPU. CPUs, they're just like installing an AIO water block or water pump on a CPU. It's like the same exact process just about for putting a custom CPU block on there. And it's the whole reason why channels like mine exist, is to make stuff like this, which seems daunting, approachable for people that might be wanting to try it for the very first time. Anyway, there we go. Just want to kind of give you some talking head pieces of advice to think about when it comes to water cooling your systems. I heard it over and over and over with my latest meet and greet in Charlotte was like, hey, you're the water cooling guy. That's what you, and I was like, you know what, for the water cooling guy, I haven't talked a whole lot about water cooling lately. So maybe it's time to get back to that, especially with hot-ass Intel CPUs and hot-ass NVIDIA GPUs, and who knows what the next gen stuff's gonna look like. So let's get ready for that roller coaster. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Sound off down below with what you think your best myth bust is in terms of water cooling. And as always, we'll see you guys in the next one.